Good evening. Hello. Welcome to Darwin's Armchair. I'm Neil Gostling. I'm a lecturer in evolution and paleobiology at the University of Southampton.
Good evening, and I'm Sarah Darwin, and I'm a researcher at the Natural History Museum in Berlin.
We're going to talk to you about the Galapagos tonight. I'll be quite honest, I'm really excited about this.
You are. We are.
It's one of the most brilliant places in the world, and if we can just share a little bit of it with you, that will be amazing. It's not going to be a travel documentary. It's not going to be our holiday snaps. We want to tell you about these wonderful islands. If we can go to the first slide, Sylvia, that would be super. There we go. So this is a picture that was drawn by and painted by the Beagle's draftsman, Conrad Martins. It's actually the Beagle at anchor in Tierra del Fuego, in the southernmost tip of South America. But I think it gives you an idea of the way that people were traveling around the world in the 1830s. So quite by chance, although no, we planned this, obviously. The Galapagos were actually discovered, the island archipelago was discovered 486 years ago today, when the Bishop of Panama, Thomas de Bolanga, was blown off course, and it was where he ended up. The oldest island is San Cristobal in the east. It's about 4 million years old. And Fernandina, the westernmost island, is only about 700,000 years old. It's a really dynamic environment. It's a bit confusing, though, because the oldest island is 4 million years. But we've got ideas, we've got pretty good estimates that finches were diverging somewhere about 15 million years, about 5 million years ago from each other. So where were the islands? It's a bit confusing. If the oldest one is 4 million, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the geology, because we've got these old islands in the east, we've got young islands in the west. Islands are being born and dying all the time. So I'll tell you a little bit about how that happens. Here is our archipelago. San Cristobal is the one on the rightmost part of the screen, lower right middle. And over to the left, you can see underneath the island, which looks a little bit like a seahorse, which is Isabella, you've got a roundish island, and that is Fernandina. And these are incredibly active. On Isabella, there are 5 active volcanoes. The large round white blob on the bottom of Isabella is a huge volcano. It's about 12 kilometers across. It's massive. This huge shield volcano, slowly releasing lava all the time, building up the islands and what have you. Fernandina is much more violent and much more exciting when it goes off, and you can often see across the archipelago when Fernandina is erupting, you can see a red glow in the west. It's quite a spectacular thing to behold. So how does that happen? What's the dynamics that are going on? Here we go. We've got South America here, and you can see just off the coast of Ecuador, about 1,000 kilometers off the coast, are the Galapagos Islands, and they sit on the Nazca plate, which is a tectonic plate, which butts onto the Cocos plate and then onto the South American plate. And you can see in the next slide that the Nazca. So you've got in blue, you have the Nazca plate, and the Galapagos is shown with the little red dot, and it's a destructive plate formation where you've got the Nazca plate is actually sliding under the plate to the east of it, South America, and that's all of these geological forces which are happening here. This is what's forcing up the mountains that run along down the south coast of South America. Why is this happening? What's happening? Well, tectonic movements, that's perfectly normal. That's happening all the time. But what has that got to do with how the Galapagos Islands are forming? Well, what we've got here is we've got a magma plume coming up from the mantle, and it's a very hot, a very dynamic area of the mantle, and it's forcing, very hot, and forcing magma up through cracks into the seafloor. And as it erupts, the magma moves up, cools, and continues and grows and forms a volcano under the sea. It grows and breaches the surface. And all the time, the Nazca Plate is moving slowly eastwards. It's moving eastwards at about a rate of 5 centimeters a year in relation to the African plate. I know I've just jumped over to a continent and an entire sea, but it's moving at this speed. And as it does that, it moves along and it moves off of the hotspot. So those volcanoes then start to die and they form quite geologically stable islands. Over time, they continue to move. Here we can see a picture. This is the Devil's Crown, which is just north of Floriana Island. We'll come to Floriana in a moment. And the Devil's Crown is an extinct volcano. And what's happened is the crater is submerged. It started to sink back, started to collapse back under the sea. And this is what's happened to the oldest islands in the chain. So yes, San Cristobal is the oldest that we can see. But actually, dotted all around in the east, there are seamounts, which are volcanoes, islands which have started to sink back under the water. They're now circled by sharks and not circled by seagulls and other birds or finches or anything else. And this dynamic, moving environment is carrying, it's not just the living environment, it's the planet which is changing and morphing all the way through so that we have this wonderful archipelago here. So let's have a look at some maps. This is Google, but this is the very first map of 1684, and it was drawn up by Ambrose Cowley. And Ambrose Cowley was, for all intent, he was a pirate. The only sort of depends if you're a wrong un, it depends who's employing you. And it turns out that Cowley and an awful lot of others were being employed by the British crown in order to pillage the Spanish main and take gold off. So if you were pirating and taking money off of the Spanish, that was considered, not by the Spanish obviously, but by the British crown, that was considered okay. And he probably would have been called a buccaneer or something rather than a pirate, but they were pirates. If we go to the next, so the pirates also were they would be operating throughout the Caribbean. They would be operating throughout South of America and all the way back up into the East Pacific. And these crabs, these are one of the most common crabs that you find in the Galapagos. This is a Sally Lightfoot crab, and it's a really unusual name. But actually, it was the pirates that gave it its name. The story goes that Sally Lightfoot was a dancer in a tavern in the Caribbean. And she was a very fleet-footed dancer. And these crabs, she also had red hair. And so this works perfectly because these crabs are incredibly fast and can jump quite large distances. I've seen them clear a good meter, and they're jumping from rock to rock in this fleet way. And they were given this name, the Sally Lightfoot crab. Absolutely wonderful. But the maps are a very dynamic thing as well. No one really knew where the Galapagos was for a long time. We've got maps here that range from 1726 through to the later part of the 18th century. And what you can see here is, number one, you've got the Galapagos sitting between 70 and 75 degrees west. We've got the Galapagos sitting roughly, 70 through to 90. And we've got two sets of islands. And you can see in the middle one, at about 80 degrees, islands known to the Spanish. Again, if you look down below, again, we've moved now. The entire archipelago has moved to 90 degrees, and there are still islands that are only known to the Spanish. And this is one of the reasons why they were so popular with pirates. No one really knew where they were. You could hide out quite happily for a very long time, and no one could really find you. And even if you had a map, a good chance that your islands weren't in the right place anyway. And so that brings us on to the British Navy. Because eventually the British Navy decided that it was going to clean up the piracy and it was going to reduce this. And so in 1798, we have this rather lovely, neat map produced by the Admiralty, by Captain Colnett for the Admiralty. And we've started to get now, you can see the sort of rough seahorse shape of Isabella in the west. You've also got probably what is San Cristobal in the south. And that brings us really up to 1835 and what Fitzroy was doing. And this is a picture of him very much later in his career. He was born in 1805. He was only 4 years older than Darwin. And that puts him in 1831 at about 26. Well, not about 26. He was 26. And he's in charge of this boat that he's going around, and its whole task was to map. It was a cartography mission, really, to map the unknown regions of the sea and really to make, allow Britain to rule the waves. Because if you have good maps, you can do that. What is absolutely brilliant about this, and one of the things that Fitzroy did, was he actually fixed the lines of longitude. And one of the reasons and the ways that he did this was that he took with him 22 chronometers from the Admiralty. They weren't cheap. He also had 6 of his own. So this was a man who was measuring time really accurately. So if you know where the sun is above your head and you know what time of day it is and you know what time it is in Greenwich, you can work, which is obviously where time is invented. You can work out exactly where you are in degrees around the planet. Fitzroy did this, and it was absolutely remarkable. Here is just a section of his map, and this is Isabella and Fernandina. Next to this now, we've got the map, the European Space Agency map, which was published last week. If you overlay them onto the next, I think that's a pretty good match. And you have to remember that Fitzroy was making his maps on a boat, which was moving certainly up and down, even if it wasn't moving sort of linearly, with men lined up along the side of the boat, taking bearings off of points along the coastline, and then comparing all of their measurements as they're going along, and comparing one bearing with the next to get these absolutely tiny changes and distances and little coves and inlets around that. And I think that you have to agree that is an absolutely exquisite piece of work there. A geostate, a satellite image and an image from 1835. That's pretty hot. That's pretty good. And there we go. So I'm going to hand over to Sarah now to tell you a little bit about the arrival.
So here we are on Captain Fitzroy's map, and we've highlighted the 4 islands that Darwin was able to land on when they arrived at the Galapagos Islands. They came in from the east, and San Cristobal on the right-hand side of the map was their first stop. And we've included this picture. This was one of my photos. I was lucky enough to retrace Darwin's voyage a few years ago, and we actually arrived at Galapagos having left mainland South America. And you're sort of straining the horizon, looking for clouds that sort of sit on top of the islands. And Darwin would have arrived in September at a season, we call it the Garua, and this is where the weather is actually more like the weather in London in the autumn than you would expect to find along the equator. So you have this sort of drizzle rain. It's never very hard. It's a sort of drizzly and grey. And interestingly, you find this climate really on the southern parts of the island. If you can get round to the northern parts of the slightly bigger islands, you can be in broad sunlight. So this is the sort of thing that Darwin would have arrived in Galapagos to see.
So when he got there, his job was to collect specimens while the ships were navigating around and taking their bearings and producing their maps. Darwin was on land and collecting specimens as much as he could. And what he noticed was there was just this unique fauna, flora and fauna, and he was aware, and he wrote to people like Hooker and when he was back in Britain, and was writing to say that these animals are really, they're unique. but they clearly show relatives in South America. And here in the middle of this picture, you can see there's a beautiful little flycatcher, a vermilion flycatcher. When I was there, this picture I took in 2018, there were about 100 individuals, 150, if we were, fingers crossed. It sounds at the moment like there are about 40 breeding pairs, which is really not very many. And we'll talk a little bit about one of the problems, one of the reasons that there are so few. But I took this picture and I've been concentrating so much on the vermilion flycatcher that I hadn't even noticed until yesterday afternoon that up in the top left-hand corner, there is a beautiful small tree finch sitting up there. That is another unique specimen. And here we go. Here are the uniquest of the birds, or the ones that everyone knows about anyway. The diversity is amazing. But the nice thing about the Galapagos, being an island and a relatively small landmass, there are fewer species on the islands than there are on mainland South America, which means you can have a single guidebook and you can tick off, and you can, if you're lucky, see a vast number of the species that are there. But here we've got 8 or 9 of the famous finches. Up in the top right, top left, sorry, you can see there's a cactus finch. In the middle, we've got the woodpecker finch. Up in the top right, on the blackbirds standing in the green foliage, this is I think a male vegetarian finch. It's a little bit difficult to tell, and I'm not even certain that the finches always get it right. But underneath it, we've got a large tree finch. Then we've got our small tree finch in the middle. The smallest of all the finches is the warbler finch on the middle left. And then we've got at the bottom, we've got, it's either a large medium ground finch or a slightly small large ground. Oh, can we go back for 1 second? We've got this this large ground finch. In the middle, we've got a female vegetarian finch. And then in the bottom right, we have a small ground finch. And what we notice now, what we have seen, Darwin didn't pick this up when he was in the Galapagos, and I always tell my students that this is really good because, number one, he didn't keep great notes on these birds, and he didn't pick up that they were finches, and so he had to, when he came back to Britain and realized his error, that he hadn't kept good notes and that he hadn't actually picked, he had to scrabble around with his friends to and colleagues from the trip to collect their notes to work out where they'd collected the birds from so he could put it all together. And they're called Darwin's finches because John Gould at the British Museum identified them as such and named them for Darwin. They are wonderful little birds. They're really very exciting. They're lovely. But these weren't the birds that Darwin really noticed. That's the next lot we're coming to. So we have here the birds that Darwin really talks about. And these are the mockingbirds. He calls them mocking thrushes on the Origin of Species, and they are these are wonderful, wonderful birds. They squawk at you and they jump at you and they flap their wings and they try to get into your room, and they're just wonderful. But what we've got here, we've got a San Cristobal mockingbird on the left, and we have 2 Galapagos mockingbirds on the right. And the Galapagos mockingbirds tend to be found on several islands, whereas the San Cristobal mockingbird is only found on San Cristobal. And what you can see is there are slight differences. The Galapagos mockingbird has very dark black eyes and it has a darker brown head, whereas the San Cristobal bird is a lot paler grey. It has a dirtier sort of underside, and it also has these black eye stripes down here, which you don't see on the Galapagos mockingbird. Darwin from San Cristobal went to Floriana, and these were the birds that he noticed. He saw that the birds on San Cristobal looked totally different to the much grubbier looking birds that you find on Floriana. And I'm going to pass over to Sarah just to talk now a little bit about some of the other birds that we find.
Wonderful. Thank you, Neil. I think one of the things that we should probably say about the Galapagos, what makes it so incredibly unique and an amazing experience to visit, is that the animals show absolutely no fear of humans whatsoever. And the reason for that is, we think, that there are no land predators, or next to no land predators. But here we have what's called the Galapagos hawk, which is one of the very few birds of prey. So I think there's, how many species of owls? One or two species of owls?
Two species of owl.
Two species of owls, and then this hawk. And otherwise, there are no other land predators. So what we find on the islands is that all the animals are really, they're some people refer to them as tame. I don't like that word tame because they're wild animals, but they're just not frightened. They will just walk past you or look at you or check you out, but they're not frightened of you. And you can see how incredibly close I got to this hawk to take this photo. And we included this because I really wanted to show you, you know, the larva behind. This was from Isabella, and you can see the larva field behind this wonderful grey larva. And here is rather a splendid fellow called the flightless cormorant. And he has evolved from other cormorants. And you can see he has these vestigial wings here. Because of the lack of predators, there's really no need for him to fly anymore. So it's better for him to have a way of swimming and catching fish. And his wings really now are designed for swimming. And there he is standing on the larva, drying himself off. I'm not sure what's the next. Oh, yes. And the wonderful blue-footed boobies with their beautiful turquoise feet. They do this wonderful courting ritual where they honk and whistle, and they sort of stamp around, waddling from side to side, lifting these beautiful blue feet up. And here you can see there's a mating pair, or about to mate, hopefully. In fact, I don't think they did. In fact, I think she walked away. But he is offering her a stick here as part of this sort of ritual. Next slide, please. And here we have the famous Galapagos tortoises, for which the islands are actually named after this saddleback tortoise, the Galapagos, which is the one in the top right. And you can see that the shells are very, very different on these four tortoises. And when Darwin was in Galapagos, he by chance met a British governor called Governor Lawson. And Lawson very proudly announced to Darwin that he could tell which island the tortoises had come from by the shape of the shell. And you can see that the shells on some of them, bottom right is a very dome-shaped shell, and top left is this much more sort of saddle-shaped with a sort of pommel at the top. So the tortoises have very different looking shells depending on which island they're from. And this was a really, really key point for Darwin in his theory, although where the finches now are more famous, if you like, in the Galapagos for Darwin's theory, it was really the giant tortoises and the mockingbirds, which Neil is talking about, that was so important. And I'll hand back to you, Neil.
So, I mean, the reptiles are amazing. They're probably, of all of the animals, these are probably the most skittish. Now, there's quite strict rules. The national park is quite clear. You must not approach the animals. You must stay at least two meters away from them. They don't have those rules. They're not for them. They're for us. And the birds will come and sit on you. And if they sit on you, you don't shoo them away as they get away 2 meters. You just sit there and you let them until they go away. You don't shoo them. You don't upset them. The lizards, however, are very much more skittish, and they will run. And I suspect that's because they do have predators in the shape of the barn owl and the Galapagos owl and the Galapagos hawk. So I think that's probably why they're more likely to run away. Have a larva lizard there. They will display. The males have this big red throat pouch, and they stand up and they flash it at each other. And then we have the geckos, which are ubiquitous throughout houses. They're really quite fantastic, and they're good for keeping down whatever the few mosquitoes that there are there. But the best reptiles, the ones that we're most aware of, are these. And I've got a couple of quotes that I'm going to share with you in a moment. But we have the iguanas, and the yellow one at the sort of the top left, this is a land iguana. And these are found different subspecies. There is a beautiful pink iguana, which is a land iguana as well. Not a huge number of them, but they are isolated on a single volcano in the Galapagos. And then we have down on the bottom right, we have these wonderful marine iguanas. Their entire diet comes from eating seaweed. They are the only lizard in the entire world that is dependent for its entire sustenance on marine algae. And each of the islands has a subspecies, and they're all slightly different. This one is one from Flora, and it is this nice red color. The ones that we see on Santa Cruz, even the males, they have a little bit of red pigment, but they're mostly grey and black. And I've just got a little quote here. So, the marine lizard is extremely common on all of the islands throughout the archipelago. It lives exclusively on the rocky sea beaches and is never found, at least I never saw one, even 10 yards inshore. It is a hideous-looking creature of a dirty black colour, stupid and sluggish in its movements. Darwin wasn't particularly fond of them. The land iguana, the yellow one that you just saw, again, was found on a number of islands. And in particular, there's a little island north of Santa Cruz where there's one of the main airports. It was also a US Air Force base during the Second World War. The Galapagos is perfectly positioned to protect the Panama Canal, and it was used for that purpose by the US Air Force. And whether they were bored or whether they were looking for training and target practice, whatever they were doing, unfortunately, the land iguana was entirely removed from Baltra by the US Air Force airmen using them for target practice, which I think is very sad. But here we have these beautiful, I think they're beautiful. They're about 3 feet long, about the size of a good-sized house cat, tip to tail to its nose. The black lava rocks on the beach are frequented by large, disgusting, clumsy lizards. They are black as the porous rocks over which they crawl and seek the prey from the sea. Somebody calls them imps of darkness. They assuredly will become the land that they inhabit. And it is wonderful. They sit there, they go out. When the sun comes up, they take some time, they bask and they warm themselves up, and then they lumber off into the water, and out they swim. And the large males go further out than the females and the juveniles. They feed on the algae. They can be out for quite some time of day. They'll come back in at around midday, a little bit later, crawl back up the rocks, and then they get into these big huddles to help bask and to keep warm, to help them, I think, to digest the algae that's sitting in their stomachs. Darwin didn't really like them. And I've got another quote here about an experiment. This experiment would never get ethical approval these days for all the good reasons. But here we go. So one day I carried a marine iguana, to a deep pool left by the retiring tide, and threw it in several times as far as I was able. It invariably returned in a direct line to the spot where I stood. It swam near the bottom with a very graceful and rapid movement, and occasionally aided itself over the uneven ground with its feet. I several times caught this same lizard, and by driving it down to a point, and though possessed of such perfect powers of diving and swimming, nothing would induce it to enter the water. And as often as I threw it in, it returned in the manner above described. Perhaps this singular piece of apparent stupidity may be accounted for by the circumstance that this reptile has no enemy whatsoever on the shore, whereas the sea, it must often fall to be prey to the numerous sharks. So going back again to why the animals that we encounter don't seem to be particularly bothered by people, there aren't any land predators. This is a lizard, as I say, about the size of a house cat. It's perfectly safe on land. It will feed in the water, but in the water there are sharks. So you can throw them in and they'll come straight back out. Darwin was also, I don't think Darwin did this himself, but there were certainly people on the Beagle who were testing the iguanas for how long they could hold their breath, and several of them had weights tied to their tails, and they were dropped into the water and then pulled out again over a period of up to hours, to see how long they were doing. Again, I don't approve, but it's interesting to see how long these animals can survive and hold their breath. Another thing, they're perfectly adapted. That I don't know if any of you have ever smelt a chicken coop, but that's what it smells like. As you walk past them, there's this rich aroma, and well, they're just eating vegetation and they're producing guano, but then they're also excreting the salt and that they've drunk and that they've ingested, and they have these glands in their nostrils, and they're constantly snorting out and spraying out salt. So you've got this horrible snotty lizard living in what smells like a chicken coop, and I absolutely love them. I think they're fantastic.
Very, very well described, Neil. Thank you. We've gone to the next slide then. Yeah, so it wouldn't be complete if we didn't talk about the plants of Galapagos. And actually, Darwin was very aware that the birds, for example, he saw similarities in these birds to birds that he'd seen in South America. But he really was surprised to find the plants, because there's a very, very high level of endemisms, and that means plants that are not found anywhere else in the world, just in Galapagos. And here we have two groups of plants that are only found in the Galapagos Islands. They're what we call endemic genera. So you have Darwin's daisy on the left-hand side, which are found on several different islands and several different species. And another daisy plant called Scalesia on the right-hand side. I think we call it the giant sunflower tree. You call it the giant daisy tree. I'm not sure. I'm not sure which of us is right, but the giant sunflower tree. And it's actually, it really is a daisy, but it has turned into a big tree. And here you see something very cool, which is different types of trees on different islands. They're very easy to distinguish, and it was a really important thing for Darwin. I think he actually wrote, an ornithologist would recognize the birds of Galapagos, but would a botanist recognize the plants? So he was really beginning to think, why is it these plants are so very different from the coast of South America? And if we move on to the next slide, please. And this is rather a lovely, it's actually a cotton flower, and it's an endemic cotton only found in the Galapagos Islands, with this lovely yellowy apricot-y flower. The next one, please. And this is the lava cactus, again, another endemic plant of the Galapagos. And you can see here, it's one of these pioneer species. It's growing on a lava field. And it's one of the very, very first species of plants that you'll find on a new lava field. And then we have these wonderful trees. So we've included this slide. You can just see on the top of this little island, there are these puntia trees. So they're prickly pear trees. And you find these growing all over the Galapagos. Again, sometimes they can form these wonderful big trees, and then sometimes they're quite small plants. And over to you.
So there is this wonderful diversity of insects. Again, not so many that you can't find them and see them. It's not just insects though. We've got spiders, we've got the endemic centipede. This one was quite small. It's in the bottom of a plastic cup. We removed it from the Zoology Museum at the Charles Darwin station. We've got the Galapagos huntsman down at the bottom. Again, I removed that from a friend's bedroom. He wasn't very happy. But it had a leg diameter of about 10 millimeters. We've got these beautiful painted locusts. The little red dot at the top there is the Galapagos ladybird. No spots. It is a really pretty little beetle. But down at the bottom, and actually on some of the one of the Scalesia species, we've got two bees, and we've got this black shiny bee, which is nearly twice as large. You can't tell that in the picture, but the black shiny bee is nearly twice as large as the little yellow, golden, green-eyed bee in the left. And if you were to catch them and count them, you'd see there's probably about 20 to 1 roughly of the black bees to the yellow bees. The yellow bees are males of the same species. It's the Galapagos carpenter bee, and they are absolutely fantastic. The geography and the geology is phenomenal. In the bottom picture here, we can see some of the scrubby cactus forest spreading out from the sort of the southern, the first sort of higher part, the first sort of about 100 meters at most above sea level, 30 meters maybe, of back from the coast along that. You can just see a dark blue line. That's the sea, and you have stretching out. You have this forest of cacti. There's all sorts of other scrubby plants involved in it as well. But this is the sort of thing that the pirates would have discovered. Certainly the sort of thing that the Bishop of Panama would have seen. And it's really the sort of place that this very unwelcoming, stark cliffs lined with cacti, almost impenetrable in places for most of it, that Darwin would have found. So they would have had to hack their way through. One of the reasons they got to the Galapagos on the 15th, they found San Cristobal. They didn't land on the islands again until the 16th. They were looking to find somewhere to land. But you can see down in the bottom right here, you have this. These are the cliffs. You've got the Opuntia lining the top. And the top picture, which is the same on both, this is a collapsed lava tube, okay? So this is it pretty much in the middle of Santa Cruz, which is the large island in the center of the archipelago. And the lava would have been running through tubes, and that whole section has collapsed, and it drops down maybe 50 meters. And there are just trees and lush plants growing, where in the highlands it's wet. It's just the most remarkable place. You've got specific finches that live in the area, but it's this land of contrasts. We have this lush, wet highlands. We've got these impenetrable coasts, and the bottom left-hand picture. This is the caldera of the Sierra Negra volcano, the largest and most active volcano. I believe it's the second largest crater on the planet. It is constantly producing a little bit of lava, and but you've also got people. When I was there, you could see people. You could see a little truck down in the bottom where people were mining. I think it was sulfur that they were mining. It's the most remarkable place that people have, for all of the time people have been there. People have been getting something. They've been getting hold of some of the resources and taking advantage of them and making this place habitable.
Yeah, so we move on to people, and I think the reasons that the Galapagos is such a desirable tourist spot we've made clear, because of these unique animals and plants that are found there, and the fact that they show absolutely no fear of humans. So it is the most incredible place to visit. Just in terms of seeing this wildlife. So there's about 250,000 tourists who visit the islands every year. They're mostly encouraged to be on boats and travel around the islands. There are now a few hotels on 3, I think, or even actually 4 of the inhabited islands now. There are hotels. So there is accommodation for different budgets, as it were. You can go and stay on the islands and do sort of day trips. And this is a day trip up into the highlands of Santa Cruz, which is that central big island in the middle. to a tortoise reserve where you can see, I think it's actually the guide that is crouching next door to it, because as Ray quite rightly put in the comments, you know, everybody has to do the 2 meter distance. For us, it's just COVID times, but in the Galapagos, you have to keep 2 meters away. So you have a large infrastructure to support these tourists. It is incredibly well organized, I have to say, so much so that when you're on a boat, you tend to travel at night, and you arrive at your sort of bay in the morning, and you can still go and land on the islands and feel like you're the first person there, because I think they've done the tourism so beautifully and so tastefully. And you have to have a guide with you. The guides are all trained in natural history, so they really are. They are doing so many things in Galapagos to such a high level, and working so incredibly hard to protect their nature. Yes. I think when Darwin talked about a little world within a world, this is still the case in Galapagos. And somehow I always feel, if we can save Galapagos, then we can save the rest of the world, or perhaps the other way around. If we can't save Galapagos, then what hope is there? Because there is so much effort put into the nature by the local people.
There's a question actually that I think is probably quite a good one to bring up now. I don't know your first name, I'm sorry, S. Lane. How do they keep the unique flora and fauna safe from tourists? And I mean, it is remarkable. There's only 3% of the Galapagos which is given over to towns. 97% of it is unspoilt. Between islands, there's biosecurity. So if you're going to go from Santa Cruz to San Cristobal, you aren't allowed to take fruit and vegetables from one island to the other. Your bags are checked and sealed on one island, and they are unsealed when they get to the other side. There's sniffer dogs at the airport. Everything. I mean, it is remarkable. So they're working exceptionally hard.
Yeah, no, they really do. And so to support this tourism, obviously there's a pretty high population of local people. If we can have the next slide. So here are some, the animals roam into the towns at will. You regularly see, this looks like an extraordinary picture of a sea lion lying on a bench, but this is actually quite a normal sight. And the marine iguanas come in through the town, the Sally Lightfoots, you'll find lots and lots of finches and mockingbirds. They kind of walk in and out of your house. If you leave the window open, they'll be inside. It's absolutely charming. So there's around, we probably estimate somewhere between 35 and 40,000 Galapagos living there. I think there's probably around 35,000 who are sort of registered, and then a few more that maybe not registered and perhaps not permanent. So as you can imagine, that's a lot of people to feed, along with the 250,000 tourists. We have this dilemma in a place like the Galapagos, where I think there's very, very little, in terms of food to eat on the islands. We're about to show you a few things that you could have eaten when you'd have arrived there. But of course, now you're not allowed to. If we can go back just one slide. Yeah, thank you. And so you have this dilemma. Do you bring food in to the islands to feed all these people and risk bringing in insect pests, or do you grow your own crops in fields and farms and risk plants escaping? This is a dilemma. I think they've come to quite a good compromise, really, where they have this incredibly, as Neil was saying, from a tourist perspective, they're really, really careful with the quarantining, but also with bringing in all this food. They're really, really careful to make sure that they don't bring in insect pests, which I think probably takes us on to the next slide.
So this is, we have a couple of things here. when on the south in South America, cattle are a very important part of the farming economy, and cattle have been brought over to the island, and there is a bird, Crotophaga anni, the tick-eating bird, which is this one at the top, the black bird with this sort of prehistoric-looking bill, this sort of iridescent armored feathering. It's a remarkable bird. It's about the size of a magpie. They fly around in flocks and supposedly eat ticks. And so they were actually imported to the Galapagos to manage the ticks on cattle. They don't really seem to eat ticks. They might eat nestlings. No one's quite sure, but they shouldn't be in the Galapagos. And so there are efforts to remove them. And if they turn up on certain islands, you do have to report them. Another specimen down there, there's a little sort of sun spider kind of thing. It's not a spider, but there we go. This little chap down at the bottom right. Another one that we found had somehow managed to work its way into the Zoology Museum at the Charles Darwin Station. We removed it very, very quickly. But I think the most troubling one is this little fly up at the top. This is Philornis downsii, and it's a fairly harmless looking fly. When you look at it, it's a house fly as an adult. It's very closely related to our blue bottles. You know, it's nothing particularly special, and it's found all the way across South America. And what it does is it lays a couple of eggs in the nests of birds, finches, and the like in South America, and there's no particular problem. However, some have managed to get into the islands. And we can see a little finch here. Now, this finch is alive and it's okay. It has a slightly distorted beak, and you can see on its nostril, on the picture on the left, it has an enlarged nostril, because what happens here is the fly lays its eggs in the bottom of the nest. The maggots hatch, the maggots come up, and they actually suck the blood of the chicks. They move into the nasal passages, and then unfortunately they have decimated is not the right word. That's removing 1 in 10. They have absolutely obliterated the populations of the mangrove finch. The mangrove finch is down to about 40 pairs. And the people at the Charles Darwin Station, the Lambo Group, have done an enormous amount of work on this. It's absolutely phenomenal work. And they are starting to win, and they are starting to bring back and reintroduce mangrove finches that they've been breeding in captivity and support, well, breeding in the islands, but breeding in the absence of Philornis. They're doing a great job. Over to you, Sarah.
Yeah, so I always feel that no talk about the Galapagos is complete without mentioning, you know, what happens to the waste of all these tourists and all the residents. Now I have to add, things have improved greatly, but this was one of the rubbish dumps on the main island, Santa Cruz, which is that big round central island in the middle of the archipelago. And I have the dubious pleasure of actually doing field work in rubbish dumps and other such places, because I work on an invasive tomato. So these are tomatoes that were introduced into the Galapagos Islands as a sort of probably not really a crop plant, but as a plant that you would grow in your back garden. Of course, tomatoes always follow humans around, the seeds. And so what you find in this rubbish dump are lots and lots of introduced tomatoes. And if we have the next slide, and this, you can see the scale of this. This is a mine where they remove the red gravel. It's the red mine, and this is for roads and things. And again, you find the tomatoes growing on sites like this, so they're quite good in disturbed habitats. And then if we go on to the next slide, so this is my rather lovely tomato plant on the left-hand side, again growing by a roadside, which is another sort of disturbed site. So there are 2 species of Galapagos tomatoes that are endemic to the islands. and they have yellow to sort of orangey fruit. And then you have, so on the right-hand side of that slide, you'll see this sort of lemony, yellow, greeny fruit. That's one of the endemic tomatoes. And then on the left-hand side, you have this red-fruited tomato, which is the invasive tomato that has been brought in by humans. And interestingly, what I found around the rubbish dump, where you find populations of the introduced tomato with the populations of the, or nearby populations of the yellow endemic one, you find these orange hybrids. And this is just another example of the types of things that can happen with invasive species, is you can get this hybridization where they crossbreed and they produce fertile offspring, and very soon you can find that, depending on the characteristics, depending on which, you probably always find the endemic tomato down by the coast where it's incredibly dry, because these endemic tomatoes grow really, really well in dry environments, whereas the red tomato grows better in the slightly more moist environment, and then you find the hybrid growing in between. And actually, you know, Neil and I were talking earlier, and he was saying to me, "Can you eat the tomatoes?" And I was saying to him, well, actually, we've all eaten Galapagos tomato. Almost certainly. If you eat tomatoes, you will have eaten a little bit of germplasm from the Galapagos tomato, because of a couple of characteristics which these Galapagos tomatoes have. One is this, it's a pickability characteristic, where if anybody's ever grown tomatoes at home, you find that when you pick a tomato, you're left with what we call the sepal, the green leafy bit at the top of the fruit, and a bit of stalk. Well, there's one small population of these tomatoes in the Galapagos that don't break off at the stalk. They actually break off at the top of the fruit, so that when you pick them, it's just the fruit you pick. And this characteristic has been bred into domestic tomatoes, and it allowed mechanized picking. So that's why we all will have eaten Galapagos germplasm, Galapagos tomatoes. Yeah, so that's and also they're salt tolerant, as I say. So you actually find them along the coast, and this character has also been bred into domestic tomatoes. So they've been very useful to the tomato trade. Yes, so this was a satellite image taken off the coast of Ecuador in June 2020. It hit the news. Many of you may have actually seen it. And what it shows, these white dots, the Galapagos Islands are top left, and the coast of Ecuador is to the right of the slide. And these white dots are ships. And here you see, between these two economic zones, which are no fish zones for non-Ecuadorians, you see this fishing fleet of around 300 ships. It's nearly a village. You've got fishing ships, you've got refrigerated ships, and you've got ships carrying fuel. And they are there basically catching all of the fish that leave these two zones. This just gives you an example of the scale of the threat of fishing that you overfishing that you get in this region. And while shark fishing isn't legal, you find that if the fishermen find sharks in their nets, they're actually permitted to sell them, and it's called a bycatch. And they estimate well over 250,000 sharks are caught by this method, this bycatch method, by mistake effectively, or by mistake. From this region, 250,000 sharks, and around 85% of the shark fins on sale in China originate from this Eastern Pacific region. So it's a really, really serious threat. But just as an example of how hard the Ecuadorians work, President Lenin Moreno has set up a commission. He's trying to work out strategies on how to protect the Galapagos marine environment. Of course, pressures on the Galapagos and on Ecuador in general have become even greater, of course, with COVID times. There's pressures coming from all directions, due to the economics. And of course, in Galapagos in particular, around 80% of the people in Galapagos rely on tourism, either directly or indirectly. So COVID times have been incredibly tough, and organizations like Galapagos Conservation Trust, which are a British-based charity, please go and check out their website. I think it should be in the chat. They are working incredibly hard to support the work in the Galapagos Islands and to help local people who would be normally working as tour guides or something, but with the tourism absolutely flattened because of COVID. They're helping to support them to find other forms of work. And you'll find that local people, they're growing vegetables now. They never used to be doing that. And they're having little stalls outside their houses trying to sell things. So if you feel inclined to support the work, there's the links. I can see that Sylvia's just put the links in the chat. That's wonderful.
So I'm very, very lucky in that I have a master's by research group, and I've been to the islands now 3 times. I should be going back, COVID permitting, in September or the next year, or July the year after, depending on how the pandemic is working. But this is my last group. They all did extremely well. And we're standing on San Cristobal, and we're standing at this rather fine fiberglass statue of Charles Darwin. It is a little bit peculiar, but I really love it as well. Overlooking what I believe to be the bay that he landed on. It's the most remarkable place and wonderful. We have the next slide. And this is sunset. So there are lots of pressures on the Galapagos. There's lots of, as much as it is a laboratory for evolution and in an easy to examine place, because that's what we do. The MRES group goes out, we catch and measure the beaks of finches to see how they are responding to human food availability. Because if the small tree finch is eating small berries and things, and if the vegetarian finch is eating flowers, that's all well and good. And if the cactus finch is eating cactus flowers, and if the warbler finch is eating little insects, and so on and so on and so on, that's all fine. But now there's a new foodstuff for them, and so they're taking advantage of it. Birds aren't stupid. The idea of a bird brain is a terrible, terrible slight against birds. Birds are pretty clever, and if they can get hold of a novel food source, they absolutely will. And so maybe it will be crisps, maybe it will be tasty, tasty brioche, and they'll be eating it and adapting to it. And you don't need to have a giant bill to be able to eat nice, soft, sugary bread. And so you can get your nutrition, you can get your food a lot more effectively. And we are seeing evolution happening in front of us. I'd love to say that this was my research. I've jumped onto the shoulders of giants, quite literally, and Peter and Rosemary Grant from the States have been doing this over a course of 40 years, and I'm using this as part of the teaching on the MRES program. If the Galapagos shows us evolution, the Galapagos also shows us how the changes to the environment that we're making, how fragile an ecosystem can be. And so we can get a view of what is happening in the wider world by what's happening in the Galapagos. And as Sarah said earlier on, I think we can save the Galapagos. I think we can absolutely keep it safe and keep it there for us all to appreciate. And this is a group which is right at the forefront of this, the Galapagos Conservation Trust, and there's the URL is at the bottom there, and Sylvia has put it in the chat. But there's lots of things that we can do, and actually you can join them immediately if you want to and get involved. They have talks, they have all sorts of things. There's lots of stuff going on, but you can know that your membership is actually helping to conserve and preserve these absolutely beautiful islands with their endemic species, with their unique ecosystems, with the beautiful evidence for evolution. You can see it all there. I am quite chuffed, actually. It's not a huge amount, but every little helps. Over on Facebook, we have the dinosaur on your windowsill, and over Christmas we were selling Christmas baubles, Christmas decorations for the dinosaur on your windowsill, and 20% of all of the decorations sold is going to be sent off to the Galapagos Conservation Trust. And we've just seen that Hubble Gifts will be giving us £55 to send off to the trust. It's not just for Christmas, though. You can still get a little dinosaur on your windowsill decoration and hang it in your window. So there's another way that you can get involved as well. So I think that's the end of our discussion at the moment, but do you have any questions? Thanks, Max.
Yeah, thank you. One person asked whether we recommend to go to Galapagos with kids 10 plus. I think 10 plus is
a really difficult one.
It is, yeah. I mean, it's being a tourist in Galapagos to get round all of those islands. It's hard work, if that makes sense. And I would say that 10 was quite young, actually. And it's probably, it's the sort of place that one kind of, probably goes there just once as a tourist. And so I would probably wait a tiny bit. Yeah, I think because it's a lot to see, and in a way to appreciate it, I think a little bit of maturity is probably good.
Yes, and I would agree. And just as a word of warning, in order for sort of getting between islands, there are boats, and the boats are pretty, they're not tiny, but they'll take about 25 people sitting nicely packed next to each other, and the sea is quite bumpy, and it's always quite an exciting journey. And the last time we went with the students who you saw in the picture, we took one boat trip. Previously, when we've flown to Santa Cruz, gone to Baltra, over to Santa Cruz, and then taken a boat to San Cristobal, and then a boat back. It was so bumpy when we did that last time. We decided we fly to San Cristobal and take a single boat to Santa Cruz. And I promise you that the Neptune realised what we were up to and got back to us anyway, because they made the single boat ride twice as bad as it would have been if we'd gone. Oh, it was awful. It was genuinely the worst thing. So if you've got small children, it is not an easy way to get around.
Yeah. No, I agree. So somebody called S, I know we're not allowed to mention the surname, so S says, how do they keep the unique flora and fauna safe from tourists? Mm-hmm. Well, because each tourist group has to, by law, have a tour guide with it, a trained tour guide, and there are marked tracks that you have to stick to. And you are very much told what you can and can't do. And, I always think how much damage can you do walking across a lava field? Yes. They make sure these paths are really, really, really well marked. You're not allowed to leave them. If you do leave them, then your tour guide tells you off. They take this very seriously. So I think that's how they do it, and it's actually quite remarkable, really, that 250,000 tourists are going through those islands. The things that are more worrying are, the food, the waste,
Yes.
the rubbish,
Yes.
that's more tricky. So if you do go to Galapagos, don't dump your batteries, take them away with you. Don't take stuff that you need to throw away. Really, that's in a way what Galapagos is, this microcosm, for the world. Really think about what you would throw away, and try not to dump it in Galapagos.
Yes, that's very good. That's very good. So there's a question from Better Doors. So do the islands get older? As you go east? And how does the age of the islands affect the range of species you find on them? That's a really good question. And I'm not certain that I have a great answer, other than when they're very young. I mean, Fernandina is still erupting. It is all lava. There's little bits where you've got pioneer species starting to move in, but I walked up Sierra Negra and I had some very nice stout walking boots on, and I was very proud. I had to throw them away recently because they really had gone, but I moved my toe. I didn't kick it. My toe moved across a piece of lava and it cut through the rubber. It cuts, it cracks, it fractures, and it gives you a razor sharp edge. It is not an inviting place to live. So as the islands become older, then you start to get the and they become more established. Then you start to get a diversity of organisms building up. And we see, but again, because the islands are all slightly different, they've all got slightly different rainfall. There's different zones on the different islands. Some are further north, some are further south, some are a little bit taller, some are a little bit short. You've got similar organisms on each island, and you've got similar organisms in different zones on each island, but they're not necessarily the same species. The finches are found in different zones on similar islands. There are a couple of islands which have endemic species, but many of the finches are found across many of the islands. The mockingbirds are, again, you've got the Galapagos mockingbird, which is found across many, but on some islands, you've only got a single species, and that is different from the other islands. So you end up with similar sorts of organisms, and this is one of the things that Darwin noticed. You've got similar sorts of organisms in similar sorts of niches, but they're not the same species.
But your question started with, are they older towards the east? And yes, that's right.
Sorry, yes.
The older islands are on the east side, the younger islands are on the west. And if we were able to come back in another, 10 million years, there would be more islands to the west, and the islands to the east would be submerged. So it's just so they're growing and they're maturing, and then they're kind of dying.
Yes. There's another question from S. What about global warming? Does it affect the islands and the species dramatically? And yes, they have regular El Nino effects, so they get very this involves a lot more rainfall or a lot less, and that can drastically affect everything. The birds, sea lions often die when there's a bad El Nino. So yes, there's the species climate change is global. It is going to affect different regions slightly differently. Some places will get hotter, some places will get colder, some places will become drier, some places and the species just can't keep up with it. The islands are they're at as much risk as anywhere else, but they are very small, and the smaller an island is, the smaller the area that you have, the fewer species that it can maintain, and so there is more risk to the species living on an island if there's a sudden change, because there's fewer of them.
Yeah,
it's really so. Yes, global climate change rather than global warming is a huge issue for everywhere, but particularly these small isolated places with relatively small populations of organisms.
Yeah. And here's one for you, Neil, I think. What's your favorite species that you've encountered?
Goodness me. How long have you got? Oh, I know I'm quite aware that,
Where to start on that one? We haven't mentioned the penguins.
Well, I haven't seen the penguins.
Galapagos,
I went to the wrong side of Isabella, so that's one of the ones to tick off another time. The penguins are remarkable, and they are one of the few. It is one of the few places in the world where you have penguins in the northern hemisphere. Now, granted, it's only slightly above the equator, but it does just pop them into the north, and I believe it's actually the only place in the world where you have northern hemisphere penguins. There's so much. It's a wonderful.
And they're tiny. I think they're around 35 centimeters.
Yeah,
they're absolutely gorgeous. The little penguins. Yeah. And
but it's just remarkable. I mean, I genuinely love the mockingbirds. I think they're phenomenal. They're funny. They're noisy. They shout at you. What are you doing? What are you doing?
They strut, don't they?
Do. Oh, absolutely.
They kind of own the place.
Yeah.
I love those mockingbirds as well. Yeah.
But from a plant point of view, I love the Scalesia. I mean, I think it's remarkable. I mean, we've got these big woody daisies, and they've got little white daisy flowers in many of them, but they're big woody plants, and some of them are standing 10 meters tall. They're big. They're reasonable big trees, and certainly compared with daisies. So yeah, it's pretty amazing. So, do we have any more questions?
I can't see any.
No, I can't see any. So I think probably at this point we should say that this has been part of SOTSEF, and the festival continues until Sunday, and there's lots more events that you can get involved with. You can see on the screen there you've got a link, and that can take you, and if you've got your phones out, you can quickly scan the QR code, and that can take you to the website and allow you to see what events are still going on. There's the opportunity to give us some feedback. I would absolutely love to know what you think of the event we've run tonight. And again, there'll be a link in the chat that you can follow. And if you go to sotsef.co.uk, you can find the full programme of events that's going on. And I think, before I forget, because I forgot last time and I still feel guilty about it, thank you ever so much to Sylvia and Thea, who've been behind the scenes, making sure that we don't look terribly awful. I'm very, very grateful. Thank you ever so much. And thank you for Sarah for letting me bang on for as long as I have.
Thank you, Neil. And thank you, Sylvia and Thea. Wonderful.